Thank you, the BART connection, and I will be sharing my screen shortly. But what I will do just now is to recap and just remind you. Annulling of a marriage means that the marriage did not exist. Now, the Gemara on which this is based is fairly straightforward when it comes to a marriage that was illegal or badly done. In other words, couple get married, rabbis say, terrible thing, you either kidnap the bride or you didn't get married in front of representatives of the community, or you forced the bride to agree to the marriage. We don't agree, and we're going to take your marriage away because we are in charge of marriages of Jews. As we say in the traditional marriage ceremony, Hareat Mekudeshadi B'Tabad Zo Kedat Moshe v'Yisrael. Doesn't say Kedat Ha'el, the religion of God. It says Moses and Israel. That is the halachic authority. So that's fairly clear. The also the rationale is fairly clear, and it does make sense. The problem arises out of the cases in the Talmud where we see that the rabbis are annulling a marriage lamafreya, retroactively. In other words, they are saying, well, you got married 20 years ago, and now you've done something that we don't like. Now, what you don't like is clearly within the area of marital law. In other words, the example we gave was of that very difficult situation where somebody sends a get and cancels the intention to divorce before the get gets to the hands of the wife. The rabbis say terrible thing because, you know, you sent a get via.
We don't hear you. Hello.
Mute. Good. Okay. Somebody muted me, and it wasn't me. Anyhow, so now you can hear me. When you want to undo a marriage after many years, it's clearly problematic. Okay, much more problematic. And the Gemara, in fact, used a different phrase in relation to annulling a marriage because the marriage itself is illegal or is reprehensible or whatever, and it's done at the time of the marriage. We say, Hu asa shelo kahogen, the groom acted improperly, and therefore the rabbis asu gam shelo kahogen, they also acted improperly, and they said, we're going to undo your marriage, which is a serious step. But when they decide to do that because you acted badly and improperly in relation to your wife, but this is many years after the wedding took place, that's a much more serious proposition. And then we have a different phrase. We have Afgainu Rabbanan Lekidushin Minei. The rabbis take away the marriage, and the word we have to add that they don't actually use is retroactively, lemafreya. But that's a serious step. You are basically denying the sacredness of the marital bond. Now, when couple gets married and everything in the marriage is formally correct, then to come along 20 years later and say, well, actually, you were just living together without the sanctity of marriage is a very serious breach in the entire institution. So you might say, why bother to get married Jewishly at all? If all that's going to happen is that 20 years down the line, after your 10 children or what have you, the rabbi suddenly turn around and say, well, we don't like what you did in relation, say, to the divorce, and therefore we're going to cancel your marriage. And there are serious problems. And we saw, and this was something that we talked about last time, that some of the important Rishonim say, well, if you're going to do that, if you're going to do a retroactive annulment of marriage, then you have to have some element of divorce in the story. Doesn't matter that the divorce didn't actually take place because the husband, in our case, canceled his intention, but there has to be a get kol duhu or sarach shel get. And when we looked at the famous case of the Maharsham, we saw that the Maharsham did exactly that. He only acted in a case in which a get was given and then the intention to divorce was cancelled. So you could say that the Bet Din is not replacing the husband entirely in the field of divorce. They are, as it were, giving expression to his first intention, which he then cancelled. But how do you know that he's really sticking to his guns? Perhaps he will change his mind again. So we are, in fact, effecting the dissolution of the marriage for him. We can't make the get a valid get because he cancelled his intention. All we can do is remove our approval for the marriage retroactively. So, of course, and there's a lot of learning here, and Jean and I have been in some correspondence, and there's far too much to say in this shiur. So what we will do, Jean, with your permission, I will send you a very detailed reply, Beli Neder, in a couple of weeks when we get back. I mean, I'll be giving the shiur next week, but we won't be back home for another couple of weeks. And then I will give you what I hope will be a lengthy and very halachic exposition of this. But I'd like to hear your impression of what we do this evening as well on the theme of what happened in the development of Afghan Kiddushin, annulment of marriage, and that's what we are going to do now. Okay? So without further ado, I'm going to go into the share screen. We'll do some reading, and I'm saying good evening to everybody here, especially Fabia, who is back has been released from the confines of her phone and is clearly able to join us, as it were, with the more upmarket media in terms of reading. So share screen is first, world of the Responsa, and we are going to be doing annulment of marriage. Good, excellent. So the first one I will go to will in fact be you, Fabia, because we don't have that much English tonight. So would you please lead us off with number 5, line 5, number 1, the next development?
The next development in this area was the ruling by both the Rashba, 1235 to 1310, and the Rosh, 1250 to 1327.
Rashba was a Spaniard and he lived in Spain, and he was the Rabba del Corte, as we'll read next week when we ask about whether chief rabbis are halakhic or not. There was an institution in Spain called the Rab de la Corte, and he was the Rab de la Corte of all Spain, Rabbi Shlomo ben Aderet. The Rosh is interesting. He was the disciple of the Maharam of Rottenburg, who you may remember was kidnapped and stuck in the incarcerated in the castle of Eisenheim for 12 years until he died there because Rudolf needed money. And the Rosh learned from the Maharam's abortive attempt to flee Germany. The Maharam was identified in Switzerland, of all places, and the Swiss dobbed him in, and Rudolf was able to get his hands on the Maharam and bring him back to Germany. The Rosh waited and very patiently put together a much more secure escape route, and he eventually left Ashkenaz. Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel ended up in Spain. The Rashba helped him get a good job in Toledo, and that's where he spent the rest of his life. So these are two seminal Rishonim, halakhic authorities in the Middle Ages. That the broad authority, Fabia?
The broad authority to annul a halakhically valid marriage was vested only in the sages of the Talmud.
So this is the first stage in what we can call the backtracking. Rabbis of the Talmud could do this sort of thing. But later authorities, who are we to undo a marriage after it has been in existence for many years? So what did the Rashba and the Rosh agree? That later authorities
are only permitted to annul in cases identical to those in which annulment was done by the Talmudic sages.
And that's exactly what the Maharsham did. If you remember in his case, he recreated that appointment of an agent and then the agent being sent off and then the husband cancelling his intention. He actually recreated the sugya in the Talmud. Or
those in which there is a specific takana, either of a permanent Beth Din or an official communal body, takanot hakahal.
So here, this evening, we're going to meet an institution called Takanat HaKahal. Now, a regular takana, we know that the rabbis if they have sufficiently eminent court, Bet Din, they act as a legislator, okay, the legislature, and they legislate. So they are the legislator, and they can, legislators, and they can make enactments, laws for the entire Jewish people. They did that in the times of the Talmud, because the Jewish population was concentrated either in Eretz Israel or in Babylon. But Gaonim also, because the Gaonim were the heads of Babylonian Jewry, which had the majority of Jews in its time. Since then, we've been split up and spread out. So the idea of a takana is very, very rare, a rabbinical takana. It was reintroduced briefly in 1950 here in Israel by the Bet Din of Rabbi Herzog and Rabbi Uziel. That's when they, in the Jerusalem takana of 1950, they said that Sfardim marrying here in Israel can only have one wife. Okay? And they also did a couple of other things. And they also raised the age of marriage for girls. But all of this stuff, okay, is very rare. Takana of a permanent Bet Din. First of all, to have a permanent Bet Din is also very rare after the great Batei Din and Yeshivot of Babylon. But the Takanot HaKahal is something else. And these were enactments made by the leaders of the Jewish community who got together in a synod, most famous one being the Council of the Four Lands. You may have heard of that. Russia, Poland, two types of Poland, and Lithuania. Now, this was a body composed of rabbis, lay leaders, the influencers of the Jewish community. And what they did was they used their communal power to impose their wishes upon the Jewish community. The idea of a takanat hakahal occurs in the Talmud. Masechet Bava Batra will refer to it as we read further on. And it flourished again until the end of the 17th century, when the Council of the Four Lands was broken up. But what you need for takanat hakahal is a mixture of communal agreement. You have to have appointed communal leaders, and you have to have approval of an outstanding rabbi. Now, most of the takanot dealt with tax, how the tax burden was to be apportioned amongst the Jewish community. And this was a very important thing for Jewish communities who lived as autonomous bodies within non-Jewish states, countries, dukedoms, you name it, they lived there. How are we going to apportion the taxes? This was the first thing they did. And then they made rules and regulations governing every aspect of Jewish life. Marriage, kashrut, sumptuary laws. That is, don't spend too much on your weddings. Live in a modest way. We need to ensure that the Jews retain a low profile and not a high profile. So it was very active until, as I said, the 16th century, 17th century, and then when the Council of Four Lands was broken up, they brought it back for a bit, but it basically broke apart, partly because the institutional support and the dispersion of the Jews made it no longer practical. So but in Spain, in the 13th and 14th centuries, Takanot HaKahal were being issued all the time, and they were kept. So Jews were really a fully autonomous body within the Iberian Peninsula. Also in North Africa, as we'll see, in Europe as well, Takanot HaKahal. So what did the Rosh do? Let's have a look. Now, Yonat, where are you? Yonat? Yonat, can you unmute? You're still muted. Yonat? You know you're muted.
Now I am unmuted.
Now you're unmuted. Fantastic. Line 11. I want to hear your fantastic Hebrew. This is the Rosh. ששאלת.
ששאלת אם יכולים בית דין לעשות תקנה שכל קידושים שיהיו ניתנים בלא דעת אביה ואימה, שלא יהיו חלים הקידושים ושיפרעו בית דין אותו ממון.
Formidable. Wow. Okay. So what we have here is a question asked of the Rosh. Okay. There was a community in Spain, city. There was a takana that nobody can marry without the parents approving the marriage. That is the parents of the bride. Okay. And if they do, we will retroactively annul the marriage. Okay. Now, what we have here are communities in which clearly marriages took place and they were rogue marriages. It wasn't like the Orthodox communities today who wouldn't dream of getting married without a rabbi and a minyan and the whole show. They were running around there and they were picking up women left, right, and center, okay? Riding down from the mountains on their horses, picking up these girls and taking them back and marrying them, okay? All you needed, and they knew that quite well, was 2 witnesses and a reasonably valuable ring. You say the right words and the woman is married. So the takanot of the kahal were to make these marriages null and void. The question then goes on about difference between mammon and isur, ritual law and financial law, and the Rosh says it's nothing to do with that here. All we're talking about is the power of the Bet Din, which is the legislature of the Jewish community at any particular time, okay, to annul a Bet Din by expropriating property retroactively. And how do we know this? Now, the Rosh introduces us to the source of the idea that the community, when it gets together, can take away your property. And the rule is hefker bet din hefker. Bet din does not mean a court of law. It means the legislature, the Jewish community sitting as a lawmaking body. Line 14, minayin shehefker bet din.
מניין שהפקר בית דין היה הפקר שנאמר, וכל אשר לא יבוא לשלושת הימים בעצת הזקנים והשרים והסגנים וכולי.
Now here you have one of the problems of reading rabbinic texts.
Yeah.
Because the ha'ikar chaser min hasefer, the main point of this is actually missing. And the continuation of the verse from the 10th chapter of Ezra is Yachoram kol ruchusho. All his property will be confiscated. Wow. So there you are. You've got to know your Tanakh properly in order to read a rabbinic text. So in the book of Ezra, we remember Ezra called a council, got all the community together, he and Zerubbabel and the leaders of the community and the Kohanim, said, this is how we have to act from now on. You've been very lax. You haven't kept the laws. We've also got to do something about the walls, and we're going to do something about the upkeep of the city. This is what we're going to do. But before that, a letter was sent round to every single member of the Jewish community at that time. So it couldn't have been very big, and it wasn't. The Jews who came back from Babylon with Ezra were by no means the lion's share of Babylonian Jewry. And what Ezra said is that if you don't come, we are going to expropriate your property. You will have nothing left, okay? And they could. So this is the basis for the Hefker Bet Din Hefker, that the Bet Din, the communal fixed court, or the Kahal, the Takanat Kahal, the mixture of rabbis, of communal notables, and the assent of the community as a whole, that's enough to get a law going, okay? So this is what we do. And as we said before, the rabbis, and this is the big difference between marriage and divorce. Marriage is in the hands of the rabbis, and they can annul a marriage if they really think that it was done very badly and disgracefully.
שתיקנו חכמי הדור למגדר מילת המקדשין ואין הקידושים חלים אלא לפי תקנתם.
And the Rosh says very clearly, every generation, whoever marries according to the rules and regulations of the rabbis. What's the phrase migdar milta mean? Anybody know? Migdar is from Geder, which is a fence.
Yeah.
Milta in Aramaic is a davar, a thing. If we're going to protect the institution of Jewish law of marriage, then we sometimes have to take severe action against those who threaten the sanctity of that marriage. Afilu
אפילו אי קידש בביאה
Shavye.
שוויי לביאתו זנות, כל שכן בכסף בהפקר, בית דין הפקר והפקרו הממון שנתן לה, ואין כאן קידושים כלל.
Okay.
אשר בין
Ben Harav Rabbi
רב
Yechiel,
לרב.
Zichrono Livracha, is on the Yechiel. This is the Rosh, Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel. Okay?
Yeah.
Shortly Rosh, Rabbi Asher. So
Yeah.
he says that even if the marriage was contracted with sexual intercourse, the intercourse will be declared promiscuous. But this is probably at the time of the marriage itself. Okay? And we're talking about that sort of thing. Marriage without informing the parents of the bride. Okay. Jack, are you with us?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
The Rashba concurs with the Rosh in relation to the authority of a Beis Din to annul a marriage on the basis of a specific piece of rabbinic legislation and extends it to a properly enacted communal takana.
So the Rashba also wrote on that. He writes more expansively, and he mentions the case in Naresh, and again a case of kidnapping the bride. And he says that both the permanent court and a community via Takanot HaKahal, they can expropriate the money retroactively. And Hefker Bedin Hefker, which he says, this is important, on line 30, Hefker Bedin Hefker midvar Torah. It has the status of a biblical law. And he gives us the whole pasuk, V'kach amru b'yevamot perek ha'isha, v'ken begitin, minayin shefker bedin hefker shenema. Shmoni, would you like to read the rest of that line, please? Line 31. Unmute.
31.
Kol asher lo
כל
yavo.
אשר לא יבוא לשלושת ימים
Yochoram.
יחרם על כל רכושו.
Yes, kol rechushay. Very good. Okay, so all his property is going to be expropriated. Batanya, beperek kama debavabatra. Okay. You want to have a crack at that? Line 32. Urasho in bnei ha'ir.
בני העיר, להיט...
Lahaspois. We'll go the
לא,
whole
להסמוס.
hog. The haspois ועל המידס ועל השעורים.
לזכור פועלי... I've had a drink. I've had a drink. I shouldn't read.
Okay. Ulasia ketsason. What you can do, according to the Gemara, is that you can regulate market measures, weights, and the rate of sale and purchase. In other words, we're going to fix the buying and selling rates of products in the market. This is the sort of thing that a secular legislation would do, and this was done by the Kahal for Jewish communities all over. The Rashbais in Spain. They had market inspectors who go around to make sure that people were not price gouging, taking too much profit. So you can see that this is the internal regulation of the Jewish community. Okay? If there's a Talmid Chacham in the town, the community, then you have to consult with him first and get his approval. And there's a case that the Rashba mentions, which is in the beginning of Bava Batra. Hanhu Tavchi, line 34, these butchers, the Itnu Bahade Hadadi, they made an agreement. The Chol David Beyoma de la Delay Likraana Lemashke. Maske. They divided the week up. This butcher had Sunday. The other butcher, okay, Goldfarb had Sunday, Goldschlager had Monday, Goldstein had Tuesday, Iceberg had Wednesday, okay? All the same. So that's why the Jews sank the Titanic. In any case, what happens if one butcher interfered and actually sold or bought on the day of the other butcher? Well, they tore his hide. The butcher got the hide of the animal that was shechted. So that was his profit. So they took it away. One butcher went to work on the day that had been appointed for another butcher. Came before Rava, and he made them liable to pay the butcher for the torn hide. But, he had worked on the day that wasn't his. He'd broken the takana of the Butchers Association. And Rav Yema said to Rava, just a second, why did you make the butchers compensate their colleague for his torn hide? He was in breach of the law, of the Takanat HaKahal. Rava didn't even deign to answer Rav Yema. Amar Papa, Papa said, quite right, he shouldn't have answered him. When is the agreement between a Jewish trade organization, valid when it has the approval of an Adam Chashuv, which is a rabbinically educated leader? Lav kol kiminayu damat nun. They cannot just make any regulation they want. Umasaya bireinu vedanti bedavar b'fnei rabotenu umoria Rav Rabbi Moshe bar Nachman hodal liddevari. So the Ramban agreed, though, with the Rashba's statement that if you do have the approval of a rabbinical authority, you can be mafkia the kiddushin. Now we go on to the next development. Our rabbis, the ones we've been talking about, Rivash and the Tashbetz. But already what you're seeing is a tendency to restrict the use of Hafgat Kiddushin, of annulment of marriage, to either a permanent court or whether it's a Takanat HaKahal, and not to go beyond that. The next development, so the next person I can see is Marcel, the next development. Unmute, Marcel, unmute. Well done.
The next development brings us to the Rivash and the Tashbetz. Both of them added another qualification to the power to annul marriages, namely the requirement that legislative authority to annul is conditional upon the approval of the halachic authorities
of the region. All
the halachic authorities of the region. Rivash explains his position in a detailed response to a question posed to him by Avraham ibn Afuhal regarding a takana adopted by the community of Tortosa.
Tortosa, a nice little community in Catalonia, of course. There was a famous disputation there in 1414, as you'll no doubt remember. Anyhow, Tortosa, the Chacham Rabbi Avraham ben Alfual Naru, that's Natrei Rachmana v'Yishmarei. May the Almighty look after this guy. Sha'alta, you asked. Hakal הסכימו לעשות גר ותקנה שלא ירשו ביד שום אדם לקדש שום אישה, כי מידיעת נאמני הקהל ובפניהם ובפני השרה. The takana was issued by the community, okay, was that no man is to marry unless the ne'emanim, or the ma'amad, the lay leaders of the community know, and they are present, or there is a representative present, and before a minyan of 10. Now you can see, and it's so clear that in the past, our very formalized Jewish wedding was not to be taken for granted by any means, okay? People were just getting married, 2 witnesses, the ring, and that was that. So many years, it took hundreds of years, in fact, to get this formalized. So there was a takana, and that if you break it, then the penalty was to be hafga'at kiddushin. Now the questioner, who was quite learned, had a lot of issues with this particular takana. I'll just go through them as they come up. First of all, he doesn't see how the community can annul a marriage that was valid under biblical law. And then he says, just a second, what happens with these takanot? You have a takanah that says you've got to get married in front of the ne'emanim, the leaders of the community, the lay leaders, and in front of me. And if not, we're going to expropriate your money. We're going to take away the money for the ring retroactively. Does that bind future generations? In other words, the takanah of the kahal has to pass 3 steps. What are the 3 steps? Step number 1, the whole community assents. Number 2, there are the lay leaders who are often called the Bnei Ha'ir, the men of the city, or the Latin 7 Bonoviri, good men. Okay, this is an institution that goes back to the Roman days. And thirdly, the Adam Chashuv, the member of the community or its leaders who has rabbinical education. But this is not, after all, a din Torah, and it purports to bind the whole community. But what happens about the next generation who weren't there at the meeting? Are you bound by the shul meeting, by the AGM, to which you did not attend because you weren't yet born? And then when you're alive and come to shul, you find that you got this rather
Ominous.
dubious or type of takana. You would never have agreed to it. And what happens about strangers who come to your town? Are they also bound by this takana? Now, these are interesting questions of constitutional law. We always, we tackle these things at the level of constitutional law. How can laws bind future generations or people who weren't there? And the answer, of course, is that they can, because that's what they're meant to do. But the questioner wasn't sure that this is a halachic move, okay? And then he also gets on his hobby horse and he says, look, clearly he didn't think very highly of the leaders of the Ne'emanim of Tortosa. And he says, I think that my townspeople are pretty weak lot. Now, we do say that in terms of rabbinical authority, we don't go around comparing stature. In other words, we don't say, this is a bit of Monty Python, isn't it? The 4 Yorkshiremen. In the old days, they were all marvelous. Who are we today? We are a nothing, okay? So, Yiftach b'doro ki Shmuel b'doro. Shmuel was a great prophet and judge. Nobody would disagree with his stature. But Yiftach was a fairly, rough and ready character. But the Talmud says the leader is the leader is the leader. But I'm not sure, says the questioner. If you're applying Torah law, okay. But if you want to go against Torah law, which says the marriage is a valid marriage, then I'm not sure you can do it. Then he says, and also we learn in the Gemara that you cannot fine people, impose monetary fines outside of Eretz Yisrael. Okay? Jean, correct, right? Ein dine knasot b'chutz la'aretz. And this is a bit like a knas. It's a bit like a fine. So anyhow, that's the questioner who only has to marshal questions, okay? And now the Rivash replies, okay? He was asked to reply on behalf of the rabbis of Spain, and he does so. Okay. Shuva, line 20. Yecholim b'nei ha'ir la'asot b'neihem, it's actually 21. Takanot u'gdeirot v'askamot v'liknos ha'over alehem midin Torah. The same thing that we learned earlier. Torah, because of the pasuk in the book of Ezra, which is not in the Torah, but anybody remember Ezra? There's a phrase there that makes an equivalence between what Ezra did, his reforms, and that great gathering in the fine, and the Torah. What's the phrase? V'chatorah yeyaseh. You look at the passage in Ezra is saying, and this is empowered by the Torah itself. So that phrase is understood by the Talmud to give a biblical stature to what Ezra did and to empower the kahal was properly qualified to pass laws that are binding on everyone. And so he begins with a statement in Bava Batra, okay, talks about Ezra and Rushain B'nai Ha'ir, and then he talks about the fact that the trade guilds, Jewish trade guilds, need to have the approval of a rabbinical figure, but not so the community as a whole. And he writes in line 33, "V'chatav haRamban zal v'mishpat hacheren sheken adin b'chol kabbalat harabim shechal aleihem ve'al zaram kid'ash katan b'kabbalat haTorah." He says that, of course, future generations are bound, just like we accept. Did we accept the Torah on Har Sinai? Were you and I there? Did we say, yes, we want to be burdened by this entire Torah enterprise? No, but we are, because our great-great-great-grandparents, whoever they were, accepted it on our behalf. So this is how it works. And then he talks about Kabbalah of the Jewish communities as a whole. V'chen b'megillah or b'tzomot. Purim was a matter of acceptance by the Jewish communities of the time. Kimu v'kiblu hayuhudim. And the same thing with fasts, okay? We know that there was a time when they didn't fast because this was the time of Shivat Zion. And then the Jewish communities decided they were going to go back to those fasts for the Churban. It's a matter of agreement and consensus. And then he goes on to say that, in fact, this is a principle without which the legal system could not work. You cannot pass a law and then have every single generation have to come and accept the law over and over and over again. It's not going to work. There's a Gemara he cites. Line 36, B'nai Baishan na'agu delahavu azli mitzur litzidon b'mali shabta. Famous Gemara in Masechet Pesachim, okay, that the people of Baishan had a custom. They would not go on Friday afternoon from Sur to Tzidon, where there was an important market, because they wanted to prepare for Shabbat. Atu b'naihu lekamed Rabbi Yochanan. And so their children, or their grandchildren, or their descendants came to Rabbi Yochanan. Amru le ahavatana hava efshar lehu. Our ancestors could afford themselves the luxury of not going to market in Sidon on a Friday. They were rich. We are poor. Anan dalai efshar lalmai. Are we bound by by their custom? Amala lehu kvar kiblu aleihen avotechem uchtiv shma b'ni musar avich al titosh toratemecha. Yes, you are bound because we are bound by the customs of our elders, the ethics of our fathers, and the laws of our mothers. The same thing about people who come and live. Once they decide that they're going to live here permanently, they immediately become bound by all the rules and the regulations of the townspeople accepted as takanot hakahal. And that's how it works in modern law as well. If you decide to go and live in England or in France or Canada, you're bound by those laws. You can't say, well, I wasn't alive and around and didn't vote for the party that promulgated that law. Deb, you are objecting.
No, I'm just saying it could.
A voice on my left is objecting.
No, I'm not objecting. I mean, that's obvious. But could a body, properly constituted later body, change the takana? Couldn't it?
Yes, it could.
Yeah.
But takana in our case has not been changed. Of course you can. That also makes sense. But anyhow, so this is the Rivash, who gives us a very comprehensive discussion of takanot hakahal, and also these basic ideas that you are bound by the rules, by the valid rules and regulations of the society which you decide to make your domicile. And it's the same principle that covers things in halakha, like how many days of Yom Tov you have to keep in Israel. So they say, if you decided to come and live in Israel, how many days do you keep? One. And if you decide that you're only here for a visit and you're going back to Chutz La'aretz, you keep 2. Now, of course, we can finesse all of this What happens if you're a halfway house? What happens if you have bought a very nice apartment in Netanya, okay? And you visit there regularly on all of these shalosh regalim. Are you considered a ben chutz la'aretz or a bat eretz Israel? We can finesse this, okay? But this is the idea that covers Jews in halakha, and therefore you are bound by the community to which you go and settle, provided that you make up your mind to live there permanently. Then he goes on to say that, of course, the kahal can make any takana that they like if they're properly constituted, okay? And you certainly can't object and say they're not as good as the ancestors, because that simply does not work. And he cites the sources about Hafgat Kiddushin, and then he goes on to make a very interesting point, and this is the last point here. This is line 9. V'takanatam hu okay. Kol demekadesh al dat hakahal v'takanatam hu mekadesh. Line 9 on page 2. No, 3. Line 9 on page 3. So the takanat hakahal is equivalent to a takanat chachamim, and therefore it is binding. Kemo shematzinu shamakadesh stam mekadesh al dat minhag ha'ir. Okay? And if you marry according to the custom of the city with all of the annulment takanot involved. Kidam Rinan. 9, line 9. Jean, can I ask you to read, please? Jean? If you're willing to read, you have to unmute. Unmute.
Bon. Que
Bon.
de, you hear me now? Que
Yeah,
de
sure, wonderful.
Metzia, bebava Metzia, perek kabel, Hillel haya doresh lashon hediot de Tanya.
Now, what does Doresh Lashon Hediot mean? Lashon Hediot means regular lay language, not rabbinical language. Hillel used to expound and treat lay language, the language of the local customs, rules, and regulations, as if they were a piece of Mishnah.
Gemara.
Or, well, there's no Gemara in Hillel's time, a piece of Mishnah or Torah Shebal Peh. So you can see how important takanot hakahal were. You even interpret the words of these takanot as if they were takanot of the famous Tanaim, Rabbi Shraban Shimon ben Gamliel, or any of the others. Now, what was the case there? Anshe
Alexandria Mekachin, ou Beshat
Okay.
Knisatan lechupa, donc Beshat Erusin, Bain Acherin, Vechotfin Otan, Bakshu Chachamim, Bikshu Chachamim Lasot Benehem Mamzerim.
All the adventures of the Jews all over. We're in Alexandria, big, bustling, huge Jewish community in Egypt. Now, they kept the old style, as Jean correctly pointed out. You started off early. As a girl, you could be married by your father, okay? And there would be a rusin. And that would be like engagement. And you didn't actually live together, but you were considered to be a married woman for all purposes. Then a year passed by, and then the chuppah was set up, and then the bride was brought to the chuppah and the groom, and then they got married on the chuppah. Then they went off and they lived together. So in Alexandria, what happened was that there were girls who were arusot. And then as the chuppah was being arranged, down from the mountains came those Jews mounted on their white chargers. They grabbed these brides and took them off, and they married them. So what did the rabbis want to do? They wanted to make any children from these kidnapped brides and their husbands. Nothing, no fault here on the woman's part at all. Mamzerim. Okay. So Amar Lahem
Nahem Hillel Azaken, Haviyu li ktubat imotechem.
So what did Hillel do? He said to these women, bring me your mother's ketubot. Okay, the ketubot of your mothers. Matzah.
Matzah shekatuv ba likesheti kansi lechupa haveli leintu velo asu benehem mamzerim. In other
Which
words,
is-
it was as today. There was no. It was it was an engagement, but not a real marriage.
Exactly. Hillel took the Ketubah, which is a lay document, it's not certainly a piece of Mishnah, says, in the previous generations, they would write, you'll be married to me officially only when the chuppah has taken place. And since these women never made it to the chuppah because they were kidnapped, they were never married, even though there was a Rusin and they were engaged. Now, what does the Gemara add? Uvavadai.
ובוודאי לאו כתובת אמותיהם שאילו הביאו לו, דאם כן מאי דורש לשון הדיוטו דקאמר,
What's he
אלא
saying there?
כתובות בנות המדינה
Okay,
הביאו
now
לו.
let's just explain. Now, the Gemara says it wasn't the Ketubot of these women, these kidnapped brides. It was other Ketubot. Hillel said, find me a Ketubah somewhere in Alexandria.
modern.
A Ketubah that says that the marriage will only be formalized when the chuppah has been done. Was not the mothers of these brides. This is Dorshin Lashon Hediot. He expounds and took other Ketubot and he applied the rule to these women here. Okay? Okay?
וכשראה שכתוב בהם כן, הכשיר את אילו.
ואף על פי שאלו.
ואף על פי שאילו קידשום סתם, לפי שהמקדש סתם באותו מקום על סמך המנהג שנוהגים לקדש על תנאי זה, קידש שלא תהא מקודשת לו עד שתיכנס לחופה. וכן
פירש הרשב"א ז"ל.
וכן פירש הרשב"א ז"ל.
The Rashba says exactly this. In other words, what Hillel did was he did like the Prusbul. He was very creative. He would not allow a whole slew of women to be treated as adulterous women, have the children as mamzerim. So he searched for a ketubah that he could use to expound the marriages of these women and say that no, they were not, even though that was the assumption at the time, that they were married when they went through the Erusin, and now they are faced with being kidnapped and the chuppahs with another man. And Hillel said, I'm going to find a ketubah somewhere in your part of the world that says that we deviate from this custom and that I can use that deviation and apply it to your case in order to prevent the creation of mamzerim. This is Hillel, okay? So the power, therefore, of Takanot HaKahal is that we also treat them as if they were actual Takanot HaChachamim. ולפי זה,
עלה בידינו שיכולין הקהל לעשות תקנה זו, והמקדש כנגד תקנתן אין קידושין, ואינה צריכה גט. זהו מה שנראה לי בנידון זה להלכה.
Stop there. So the Rivash, in fact, the whole tshuva, as you've seen, is there to authenticate Takanot HaKahal, to say that the Kahal has the power to make these rules and these regulations and to expropriate property and to take away the value of the ring and to make the marriage a nullity. And we go so far as to see that their takanot are subject to interpretation and we will interpret them in order to make life easier for the Jews. All of this, says the Rivash, is lahalacha. It's theoretical learning. I've given you a halachic analysis. Aval, and now I want you to pay very close attention, please. L'maaseh, in practice, haiti chochech lahachmir. I would go and tend to be strict. V'lo haiti somech al da'ati zeh. And I would not rely upon what I've just said. L'chomer ha'inyan, because it's such a severe matter, l'hotzia b'lo get, to release a woman from marriage without a get, especially when it is after the fact, okay? Im lo baskamat kol chachmei hagelilot. I need the haskama of all the rabbis in the
area,
in the region. Ki hechi Jean, Do you know this?
Yechid lemetayin shiva mirshura. Donc, to repart the responsibility of many people.
Exactly. It's the Gemara in Sanhedrin when Rav Ashi would decide a case of treifot, is an animal kosher or treif. He would summon all these shuvim, all these shochtim, bodkim in the area to give an opinion in order that he would just bear a chip off the block. Shiva is a little chip of wood. Shura is the big beam. And he was saying that the responsibility will not be entirely mine. If I made a mistake, I can blame all the other 9 shochtim or bodkim who also agreed.
It's caution.
With me. So here the Rivash is adopting a very cautious approach. He says it's la halacha v'lo l'maaseh, which is an important phrase, and I'll expand upon this in a second. I see we're not going to get too far in this evening, but we have next week to look forward to for the next step in this saga. But he says, I need everybody in the region. Okay, and Jean, would you please finish V'ha'el?
V'ha'el yenakenu mishgiot u'mihershel v'davar halacha v'yarenu niflaot mitorato. I see that it is a pasuk that you find in all the later shuvot.
Exactly.
This is probably the origin of this formulation.
May God spare us from making mistakes and from tripping up in matters of halacha. V'yareinu niflaot mitorato, and show us wonders from his Torah. V'shalom
v'toratcha adon nehu
nar
yigdal v'yarbe v'yifrotz larov k'nefesh meshif mipnei hayira v'hakavod lemitzvatcha mezuman u'ba'avatcha ne'eman hanishbar
v'hanitke, the broken one who suffered a lot. Yitzchak b'Reb Sheshes Zal. Remember, the Rivash lost his sons, okay, and they had a tough time.
And he was in custody.
And he was also imprisoned, and then after 1391, he had to flee to Algiers, and then he had an issue with the Tashbet. So all of that is as you said, the customary ending. So what we have from the Rivash, and also we're going to see that in the Tashbets, is a much more cautionary approach. On the one hand, there is definitely the capacity for a kahal, a community, a city, to make a takana that carries hafgat kiddushin, annulment of marriage, as a sanction. But we should be very, very cautious before we apply it. And here we have a further development from a case in Alexandria. You can already realize that time gap between Erusin and Kedushin is a dangerous time. Woman is an Arusa under Talmudic law, biblical law. She has the status of a married woman. If she goes up with another man, it is adultery, and in biblical times there was a death penalty. That year is a very dangerous time, okay? And the Arus is not allowed to live with his Arusa. That's also difficult. So what they did, they passed a takana, and this is the Tashbets, okay? Shaloi kadesh adam ela b'shat hanisuin, that we only do kiddushin at the time of the nisuin. Or perushu b'takanatam shim kidesh shaloyu kiddushav kiddushin. To remove this entire problem, we do as we do today. Now, this is the 15th century. Only from the 15th century and onwards do we get a standard practice as to what we do today. We combine in our marriage, wedding ceremonies, Erusin and Kiddushin. The first bracha that the rabbi today makes, the Khatan could make, actually, because it's his mitzvah, in order not to put Khatanim to shame, the rabbi is the one who makes the first 2 brachot. And we talk about the Arusot. Asa lanu et Arusot v'yitil lanu et hanesuot lanu. Arusot are forbidden, Nusuot are allowed. So what we do is as soon as we made the Birchot HaErusin, we go immediately into the Kiddushin, and that is the Nisuin, and that's when we are under the chuppah, the ring, the witnesses, and the bride and groom leave the chuppah entirely, completely, validly married, and they begin to live with each other, okay? So there was a takana, and the question was asked of the Tashbetz, Im yesh koach b'takanat hatzibur la'afkiah kiddushin. And can the tzibur then say, if you don't follow this rule, we will annul your marriage? וכתבת שכן עשינו בתשובת הגאון נמזל, וכל דמקדש הדעתא דרבנן הוא מקדש. תשובה, תחילה כל דבר. The Tashbetz says, beginning, I will tell you that whatever I'm going to say, this is very important. Kol davar omar lecha, okay? Shekol ma she'esa ve'eten bedavar ze eino ela lahalacha. Whatever I'm going to tell you is only halacha. In theory, I'm not recommending you to act accordingly. He says basically what the Rivash said at length. He says fairly concisely.
Danny, have you muted? Danny, you appear to have muted.
Not mute.
Okay.
But I'm now unmuted.
Yes.
Okay? So the Tashbetz goes to the same thing, Hafkaat Kiddushin. He says if you read the Ramban, okay, you will find line 28. Uchvar hikshu harishonim binyan afkata ha'achrona hazot. He says there are two types of annulment. One is the marriage itself. At the time of the marriage, kidnap the bride, rabbis come in and say, idolatry. The other one is the one we're talking about, which is the problematic one. Many years later, because of something that's done in relation to a get, say, okay, then the rabbis are angry with the husband. Can they annul the marriage, the mafreya, retroactively? And Tashbetz says this is a problem. The second type of hafka'ah, after a lengthy period of marriage, is problematic. Kama kushyot. But I'm not going to go into this now. If you've got, he says to the questioner, the chidushim of the Ramban on Ktubot, timsu hakol musudar sham ba'er hetev. You'll find all of these issues dealt with there. And as I said, one of the issues is the need for a get kol dehu, or a serach shall get. The zeni mufarashu batalmud, etc., etc. We can if all the conditions are right. Im ken areihem kachol lechol b'nei kilam kebet din hagadol. And the takana that emanates from the kahal is as if it had been emanated from the great Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. So the kahal has a power, but what the Tashbetz and Rivash are saying, I'm stopping the share, now that power is not to be used very liberally. In fact, hardly ever. And the phrase "halacha v'lo l'maaseh" is an interesting one. Leading rabbi of his time, will write you an analysis of a halacha, and then say, but this is la halacha v'lo l'maaseh. What is he thinking? What does he want? So what he's saying to you is, basically, and this is how I read it, okay? Because having read a lot of tshuvot in my life, I think the following pattern emerges. There are certain issues that are very controversial, and rabbis don't want to have to say yes if they think it's going to be too controversial, perhaps a little dangerous. Are people going to start becoming less careful with their religion? There are many issues which are borderline. So what they do is when they write to a questioner who is usually a rabbi of a lesser stature, they say, look, I'm giving you the ammunition you need. Now, if you choose to load the gun and shoot, that's up to you. But I'm not going to be held responsible for having told you to do this. And we've had a very powerful illustration of this recently, and I'll talk about this later, of the so-called get zikui, when the Bet Din in Tzfat issued a get to a woman whose husband was in a persistent vegetative state. And of course, it's not a state in which you can actually give a get because you have no capacity to perform a legal act. But the ammunition was there, and the head of the Bet Din in Tzfat, Rabbi Uriel Lavi, had showed his decision to important rabbis, the top rabbis in the Haredi world, and they'd all said, yes, this is fine, but don't do it unless two of us agree and come out in public. And unfortunately, the two were Rabbi the Garzen, Rabbi Zalman Nechemia Goldberg, and Rabbi Avad Yosef. And before the Bet Din in Tzfat could publish its tuvah, allowing a Bet Din to give a get on behalf of a husband who was in a persistent vegetative state, Rav Yosef passed away. So Rabbi Levi was left without his rabbinical protection, and Rabbi Goldberg pulled out. And but Rabbi Levi was very courageous, and he went ahead anyhow, and at a personal cost to his career as a dayan on the Supreme Rabbinical Appeals Court. But in any case, l'halacha b'lo l'maaseh doesn't mean that you can never use this. What it means is that you have to be very careful, because as we see in the Tashbetz, a typical case, or the Rivash, both of them go on at length about how it is possible to do it. We can be mafkeh kiddushin on the basis of a communal enactment, takanat hakahal. But I say l'halacha v'lo l'maaseh. What does that mean? Have I written the whole 10 pages in vain? No, I'm sending you a message in code. Okay, the code says, be careful and don't involve me. Don't say that I was the one upon whom you have to carry the can. You take the responsibility. And then the rabbi can either decide he's going to go along with the line and use this powerful and controversial sanction of annulment of marriage, or he can say, you know what, I will play safe. Halakha v'lo l'maaseh. I learned a lot. It was very interesting reading this tuvah, but I'm not going to apply it to the case at hand. What happens next in the saga of annulment of marriage, and this brings us into the politics of Batei Din and personal status law, and also the new idea that you have to have all the rabbis in the region. Now you understand what's happening here. Rivash says, without every rabbi coming on board. And then, of course, one says, when have you ever heard of every rabbi coming on board? Do we ever have a case in which all the rabbis agree? Well, but then if you have a situation in which you've annulled a marriage, so a woman in community A is not married, but community B disagrees with what the community A did and says she is married, and these are communities, many communities in the same country, the same region, you can see that that will be a difficult issue, because we don't want people's personal status, marriage or divorce, to be a subject of whether they take a train to the next town or take a plane to the next country. And it's a bit like making conversion to Judaism subject to where you are. You know, you get on the plane in Israel, you're Jewish. Then when you're out of Israel's territorial waters, you order the ham because you're not Jewish, okay? And when you come back, you're Jewish. Well, marriage and divorce will also seem to be subject to that type of consideration. And we will move on and see what happens and discuss some other cases before we get on to the fascinating topic of, are chief rabbis a halachic institution or not? Takes us to the Rivash and the Tashbetz having a fight in Algeria in the 15th century. That's it for this evening, folks. Questions, comments? Then just remains for me to say good evening, bonsoir, guten Abend, as we'd say, Shmuli, okay? Guten Nacht, besorot, tovot, and all the best to everybody.
Thank you so
Val,
much.
Thank you.
we will be in touch. Bye
Bye.
to everybody else next week, same time, same channel, okay? And hopefully some exciting things. Bye.
Bye-bye.